I'm here today to talk about this fellow, George E. Ladd. I knew almost nothing about Ladd when I started the research that led to Forged in Gold, and now I've learned so much about Ladd that I wrote a journal article about Ladd that the Missouri Historical Review published in October of 2020, and I thought he's an appropriate person to reflect upon today as we celebrate our sesquicentennial. Successful higher education institutions are a result of many, many factors. But as I looked at the history of this campus, it was clear to me that one of the most important factors is effective leadership. Whether one is looking at the Missouri School of Mines, or University of Missouri-Rolla, or Missouri S&T, one looks to the leaders to begin the research on a time period. And we've had 26. Chancellor Degani is the 26th leader of this institution. They have served for as short a period as 4 months, which was Durwood Copeland in the early 20th century, to 22 years, which was the tenure of Curtis Laws Wilson from 1941 to 1963. And their titles have changed. In the first 70 years of the institution, we called the leader of this campus a director, which is what George Ladd was. Then for 23 years, we called them a dean, but since 1964 and the participation of this campus in the University of Missouri system, we have called them chancellors. Now, in researching the history of the campus, I learned that every one of these 26 made some kind of positive contribution to the institution. But there's one fellow, and this guy right here, who made the biggest impact. I call him the most consequential leader in the history of MSM, UMR, S&T. Now, you might reasonably ask, how in the world did you reach such a conclusion? You had 26 people to select from. Well, I made the decision based on what was the institution like when a person arrived, and what was the institution like when they departed? What kind of an impact did they have on either MSM, UMR, or S&T? I think I can demonstrate why Ladd is the person that I chose. Once on the campus in September of 1897, Ladd realized the enormity of the challenge that he had accepted. He saw a poorly maintained infrastructure at the Missouri School of Mines. Most students had inadequate preparation for the rigors of the curriculum. Indeed, the campus struggled to retain them and graduate them. There were some years in the late 1880s where 0 students graduated from the Missouri School of Mines. Faculty turnover was a chronic problem, and for those who were employed in 1897 when he arrived, most of them had 5 to 6 course preparations per academic year. So they were genuinely spread out. And when he walked onto the campus, here's a nice photo of it from the year that he arrived, he found a campus with 4 poorly maintained buildings. From your left to right, the dormitory, which is now where Chancellor Degani lives. It was called the clubhouse, but that's where some students lived. Next to it was a small chemistry laboratory building. Then all of you will recognize the third building, the Rolla building, which we still have. And just to the right of it was a building that functioned both as a power plant and as a lab for mining and metallurgy students. One professor at the time said, the waterworks for the campus consisted of an old wire hand pump installed on an old well. There was one well on the campus. Most days they had to bring water from what they call the Frisco Pond, what we would call the lake at Schumann Park. The walls on the power plant building were so fragile that when Ladd arrived, he realized he had to have tie rods put through the building to keep one of the walls from falling down. At the first Board of Curators meeting he attended in December of 1897, he learned that some members of the board wanted to move civil engineering from the Rolla campus to the Columbia campus. And according to Ladd, he was the only reason that was not done. But most importantly, he quickly realized that the leaders of peer institutions did not think much of the Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy. In fact, the president of the Michigan School of Mines characterized the Rolla campus as, quote, unworthy of being called a mining school. It was really kind of a country academy, according to this president. Well, because of all this, there were periodic efforts to move all the academic programs from Rolla to Columbia. One president, Samuel Laws, proposed that in 1880. One governor, 5 years later, proposed the same thing. And as late as 1896, the year before Ladd arrived, there were some in the state legislature who thought it might be a good idea to close the campus in Rolla and move everything to Columbia. So the question is, what kind of a person does it take to fix all that? How do you transform an institution that is that woeful in 1897 to a well-respected institution 10 years later? So let me go back to my photo of him here. George Ladd was born in Haverhill, Massachusetts in 1864. So he's still a young man when he arrives in Rolla in 1897. He had earned 3 degrees, including a PhD in geology from Harvard University, where he worked under famed geologist Nathaniel Shaler. He was an instructor at Harvard before pursuing postdoctoral studies at the University of Munich. He moved through a variety of positions between 1889 and 1897 when he came to Rolla. He had worked for the state of Massachusetts World's Fair exhibit in the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. He'd worked for the Geological Surveys in Missouri, Texas, and the U.S. Geological Survey. When he came to Rolla, he left a job with the Georgia Geological Survey, and he was living in Atlanta. But because he was familiar with the minerals industry in this state, he applied for the position of director when word was published that the Board of Curators had dismissed then-director Walter Richards in July of 1897. When the board saw his credentials, they initially were not very impressed because he didn't have a degree in mines or metallurgy. But when they realized he had a PhD, and none of his predecessors had a PhD, the first 5 directors did not have a PhD, they were willing to take a chance on him. So he accepted the job, and he arrived in September of 1897, and he saw this community. Atlanta had over 80,000 people when he left. Rolla has 1,600 people when he arrives. And this is actually a photo from 1911, so this is later than when Ladd first saw this community. You can see the old county courthouse in the middle, and just behind it you might see some smoke coming out of the power plant, and you can just barely see the cupola of the Rolla building, and you can see Norwood Hall, the largest building on campus at the time. We can gain a sense of what his first impressions might have been from a near contemporary who described what he thought when he first saw Rolla riding in on the train. He said, "As the train slowed down for Rolla, I stood on the car platform. First, I saw the Frisco Pond, which didn't look inviting as a swimming pool or for moonlight boating. We pulled into the Rolla station, a magnificent, dilapidated shanty, painted Sears Roebuck red. Everything looked dirty and uninviting." This new faculty member actually thought about getting back on the train and going back where he came from. Well, when Ladd arrived in 1897, when he left the train depot, he would have had to have walked along 8th Street to get to Pine. In those 2 blocks, there were about 8 taverns. So his first impression of Rolla was, this must be a really hard drinking community. Well, some leaders would have faltered facing this challenge, coming to this tiny community, to this woebegone institution, but Ladd actually embraced the opportunity. He was a big man. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall. He was very athletic. He played football in college. He climbed mountains when he was in Europe. And on some weekends, when he got to Rolla, he went to Joplin because he bought a mine there. He liked to take the pick and shovel and work in a zinc mine just outside Joplin. And when he stayed in Rolla for the weekends, he often said, "I love tramping the old untilled fields around Rolla, hunting rabbits, quail, squirrels, and turkeys." Not only physically intimidating, Ladd was also brash, supremely confident. Some would even say arrogant. I would. He was arrogant. He later admitted that he was willful, quick-tempered, and inclined to be rebellious. Moreover, Ladd fundamentally believed that those who challenged him were people without scruple or conscience. They opposed me because they're petty people. And he was not one to forget an opponent. Years later, he described this man, Rolla architect Henry Hohenchild, in this way. He said, "This man was an arrant coward. He was the most plausible, unscrupulous liar I ever met. His activities ran on like a scum-covered, slimy stream throughout the whole of my administration." He did not like Henry Hohenchild. He also tangled with this man, Walter Williams, who was head of the executive board of the Board of Curators and later president of the University of Missouri. He described Walter Williams this way: "In no sense was he a great man. He was slight of stature, homely to the point at times of grotesqueness, and he had a high, feminine, squeaky voice. No matter the nature of the competition, whether he was playing cards, or he was dealing with local critics, or with members of the University Board of Curators, his contemporaries agreed Ladd did not want to lose." Well, whether it took a really forceful, haughty individual like Ladd to turn around the fortunes of the School of Mines, there is no doubt that he did. The first thing he believed he had to do was to improve the appearance of the campus. I'm going to go back to that photo of the campus. He said first impressions matter. So he had the grounds crew sow Kentucky bluegrass and plant Boston ivy vines at the base of the 4 buildings so they would look academic once the vines covered the walls. He added dozens of white elm shade trees, and he had masses of shrubbery and thousands of flowers planted around the campus. So it didn't look like that. It was a much different looking campus. Second, and much more significant, Ladd believed it was important to gain the support of town leaders. Notably, the editor of the Rolla Herald-Democrat newspaper, a man named Charles Woods, and also prominent railroad attorney Luman Parker. And we've named a building after Luman Parker, and you can walk in the building, and there's a statue of him above the staircase. He developed good relations with Governors Lon Stevens and Alexander Dockery, but he really focused on the state legislators. And he wasn't supposed to. That's the job of the University of Missouri president. It's not the job of the director of the Missouri School of Mines. Well, he had a great idea in February 1901 to influence the legislators. He persuaded them it was a good idea to all come to Rolla. Most of them had never been to Rolla, let alone visited this campus. So working with Luman Parker, he raised about $2,000 to transport, house, and feed the entire state legislature in Rolla. February 8th was their travel day, but the following day he gave them a tour of the campus focused on 2 buildings, the chemistry building and the power plant building. He had told the students the day before that the legislators would be on campus and they were first going to go to the chemistry building, and he said to them, "I want all of you in one lab. I want to show them how incredibly crowded it is in this laboratory." So he had them do a few experiments, and then he dismissed the students, and he had told them, "I'm going to talk for a few minutes with the legislators, and I want you to quickly go over to the power plant building, all of you, and be in one lab in that building, so when I walk them over there, they will say, oh my God, all these buildings are crowded with students." By the time the tour was over, he took them back downtown. They stayed at the Grant Hotel downtown, the nicest hotel in Rolla, where they heard several speeches, had a wonderful banquet. Well, prior to their visit, Ladd had written an article extolling the virtues of the Missouri School of Mines, and Charles Wood published it in the Rolla Herald-Democrat, and Ladd bought 300 copies and sent one to every newspaper across the state. And he asked each editor if they would write an editorial in support of more appropriations for the Missouri School of Mines. And 30 of them did. He asked them to mail their editorials into the Rolla Herald-Democrat, and Woods published 2 special issues, one on January 31, 1901, one on February 7th. That second issue came out one day before the legislators arrived, so he was able to give each legislator a copy of the January 31 issue and the February 7th issue of the Herald-Democrat, and they could thumb through all these editorials that said there needs to be more funding for the Missouri School of Mines. It worked. When the legislators got back to St. Louis, a reporter for the St. Louis Republic interviewed many of them, and this is what he wrote. Members of the House expressed a strong sentiment for a larger appropriation for the School of Mines. Well, Ladd later wrote, it was by maneuvers like this that I was able to keep a few jumps ahead of the university lobbyists. He wasn't supposed to do that, but he felt it was essential for him to be lobbying for the Missouri School of Mines. Well, over the next 5 years, 01 to 06, legislators more than doubled their appropriations for the campus, and they also appropriated funding for the addition of 2 wings and a second floor for the chemistry building, a needed workshop, a small gymnasium, and more importantly, 2 impressive buildings. This is Mechanical Hall, where Toomey Hall is now, and you can see the Boston ivy up the walls, the effect there. And then his true pride and joy, Norwood Hall. This is his legacy for the campus, he believed. It's a large building now, but it was an enormous building when it opened in 1903. Well, what I've learned about successful leaders, whether it's in university settings or political settings or religious settings, transformational leaders often pay a huge price for their achievements. And that is true with George Ladd. As he dramatically improved the campus, he made many enemies. And all these enemies cooperated in bringing charges against him that led to a 1906 investigation of his administration. And you can guess who the leader of that was. Hohenchild had been an architect in Rolla since 1881, and he had designed many buildings for the community. Commercial buildings downtown, a lot of homes, churches, and 2 buildings on the campus. He had Governor Lon Stevens appoint him as the state architect. He served in the state senate. He was known as a great orator. And when Ladd saw his 2 buildings, notably this one, Ladd said, "These buildings are monstrosities." Now, I don't know if Chancellor Degani thinks the house he lives in is a monstrosity, but that was George Ladd's impression of this building. Well, Ladd became forever Hohenschild's enemy because he said, from now on, we're going to have these contracts go out on a competitive bid basis, not the way you got the contracts. So that's the background to Hohenschild leading this effort. A second key opponent of George Ladd's was the publisher of this newspaper. This is the Missouri Sharpshooter, published in Rolla. The publisher, J.R. Miller, contended in the very first issue, which came out in 1900, that he had no enemies to punish nor friends to reward. However, in 1941, Professor Claire V. Mann, who published a massive history of the campus, interviewed several people who lived in Rolla in 1900, and they all claimed that Ladd's enemies had helped establish the Sharpshooter, quote, for the deliberate purpose of bringing about Dr. Ladd's downfall. Now, whether Miller's resolve when he began the paper that he was not going to play favorites was true or not, he quickly became Ladd's strongest critic in the press. And at one point he said, "What we need in Rolla is an investigation by Joseph Folk." This is Joseph Folk. Folk was an intriguing character. He grew up in a deeply devout Baptist household in Brownsville, Tennessee, an experience that persuaded him throughout his career. He said that behind every political question, there is a moral question. After earning a law degree at Vanderbilt in 1890, Folk joined an uncle in a partnership in St. Louis where he practiced corporate law. Folk gained statewide attention when he was an arbitrator in a major streetcar strike in St. Louis, and he used that visibility to win election as the St. Louis Circuit Attorney. Committed to eliminating corruption in municipal government, in just over a year, he indicted over 2 dozen men accused of taking bribes in St. Louis government. Well, his success got him national publicity. In fact, the great Muckraking reformer Lincoln Steffens focused upon Joseph Folk as one of the leading reformers in urban America. Well, he drew upon all this celebrity to make a successful run for governor in 1904, and one of his biggest supporters was Henry Hohenchild. So at some point, I don't know when, I couldn't find out from the letters I looked at, Hohenchild called upon Folk to investigate Ladd. But a list of complaints appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and I'm going to read them verbatim. These are the charges brought against George Ladd. He is incompetent. He permits the students to play pool. In fact, he's taught them to play the game. The students frequent the saloons in Rolla, many of them failing in their annual examinations. He seldom appears at recitations and rarely, if ever, visits one of the classrooms. He likes to play cards more than metallurgy. He allowed professors to sell their lectures to the students. In 1904, he drew a salary of $4,000 as superintendent of the Missouri mining exhibit at the World's Fair in St. Louis, while at the same time enjoying compensation at the rate of $300 a month from the School of Mines. He had two salaries. He also kept late hours and frequently did not appear at the school until noon to begin his day's work. That was the first list of complaints. Well, when nothing happened, Folk appointed an investigating committee to come to Rolla. On this committee was a former state senator, a former lieutenant governor, a prominent cattleman from Platte County, and two former state representatives. And they arrived in Rolla on January 28, 1906, and began what they call a secret session at the Imperial Hotel, which is just across from the train depot. The committee heard first from Hohenchild. He gave the longest testimony, and then some Rolla residents, including a clergyman and some students, all of whom testified in support of the charges levied against Ladd. But the next day, Ladd got to testify, followed by Charles Woods, the current and three former mayors of Rolla, the county clerk, the circuit clerk, three physicians, and several students, all of whom supported Ladd. Altogether, they heard from 40 witnesses, and from that, they wrote a 4-page report and sent it to Governor Folk. They dismissed most of the charges against Ladd, but they did conclude the following. And here I'm quoting from the report. Ladd frequently absented himself from Rolla and the School of Mines, which has prevented a full and proper discharge of his duties, of his position. While he was often away on the business of the school, too often it was without reasonable excuse. In fact, sometimes it was his own private business for which he was gone. They determined that it was true that Ladd habitually frequents a public billiard hall in the city of Rolla, sometimes during the school hours. And he plays pool in the presence of students from the School of Mines. Moreover, they discovered that the proprietor of the billiard hall has the reputation of having been a professional gambler, which was known to Ladd. The director admitted in his testimony he had approved of the students playing in the hall, but he did not believe any gambling had ever taken place. Well, they reported that while the university paid Ladd $3,600, that was accurate in the initial charges, he also received $3,000 to be the superintendent of the Missouri Mineral exhibit at the World's Fair. And Ladd gave most of his time and attention to his duties at the World's Fair to the neglect of the school. He was rarely in Rolla, they said, in 1904. Now, what's intriguing about the report is they acknowledge the following. Ladd is popular with students and the majority of the people that live in Rolla. He has done very well in getting increased appropriations and in building the physical plant of the School of Mines. Now, even though he's done pretty good work, they did find defects in his conduct and internal administration of the institution. Well, the release of the report to the press led to numerous editorials about the Missouri School of Mines and Ladd, and most of the papers predicted the Board of Curators would dismiss him. The Joplin Globe, for example, wrote, "We're guessing that the scalp of George Ladd, director of the Rolla School of Mines, will dangle at the belt of the president's administration." Well, several months later, it takes the Board of Curators forever in this. Several months later, they meet and they take actions that are a clear rebuke of George Ladd's leadership. They ordered all employees to remain at all times in the discharge of their respective duties during the school year unless excused by the proper authority. You had to get permission not to meet your classes. They further ruled that no one in a teaching or administrative capacity should play pool, either publicly or privately, as such a practice has a tendency to create a laxity of discipline and diminishes the professors' and administrators' moral influence over the minds of the students. And they further concluded, no one connected with the School of Mines in a teaching or administrative capacity should be involved in either state or local politics, except to vote. There's no more lobbying on the part of anyone from the School of Mines. Well, while the Board of Curators decided not to dismiss Ladd, there was no mistaking their censure of his leadership approach. But strangely, Ladd argued that he'd been vindicated. In fact, he said, the Folk investigation has sprung from, quote, the hell's brew of malice, hatred, and vindictiveness in the hearts of my enemies. He saw this as just a terrible power play on the part of his enemies. Still, the investigation had taken its toll on the combative Ladd. On February 1, 1907, he submitted his letter of resignation. He contended at the time that the investigation had not prompted his decision. Rather, he wanted to spend more time mining his Joplin zinc and lead mine. But Ladd also had grown very wary of the periodic rumors of administrators and some members of the Board of Curators who wanted to move the School of Mines degree programs to Columbia. That appears almost every year, some discussion. And the driving force behind that effort was this man, Richard Jesse, who was the president of the University of Missouri. If you go on the Columbia campus now and you walk into Jesse Hall, you're walking into the main administration building. It's named after Richard Jesse. President Jesse, unbeknownst to Ladd, on the day that Ladd resigned, received an opinion. He had raised a question several weeks earlier. He wanted to know, what is the power of the state legislature to remove the School of Mines and Metallurgy from Rolla? He wanted to know if he could do it, if he could get legislators to do it. And the Board of Curators secretary, after investigating state constitution barriers to the move, concluded, quote, the legislature has full power to make such a removal. So it could be done, President Jesse, if you wish to do it. Well, Jesse continued to be an advocate of the consolidation of the Rolla programs with those in Columbia. In a letter to his successor, A. Ross Hill, there's also a building on the Columbia campus named after Hill, Jesse wrote the following in a letter. I have prayed many a prayer for 20-odd years that this university might be consolidated. Dividing the university into two pieces, he believed, had been a mistake. And Jesse urged A. Ross Hill to do all he could to consolidate. And according to Ladd, after he left Rolla, 2 years after he left, he got a letter from A. Ross Hill. And in the letter, Hill wrote to Ladd, if you will keep out of the state and keep your hands off, we can move the School of Mines to the university and take care of it nicely in Columbia. Well, a final complicating factor in Ladd's tenure as director was Richard Jesse's frustration with his subordinate. Jesse wrote to the Executive Board of Curators a week after Ladd's resignation, and I'm quoting here, the School of Mines during Dr. Ladd's regime have paid very little attention to the president of the university. In fact, they've paid no attention at all to the president of the university. It was not so before his administration, and it certainly ought not to be hereafter. For example, Jesse was infuriated that he learned about Ladd's resignation in the newspapers. He did not get a letter from George Ladd. Well, despite all these conflicts, what had the combative Ladd actually accomplished in his decade at the Missouri School of Mines? When he left, the institution was fiscally sound and was a dramatically larger, better equipped campus. He had persuaded legislators to move the Missouri Geological Survey to the MSM campus. He was able to increase the enrollment from 115 to 210 in a decade. Even though he raised admission standards, the students that got into the Missouri School of Mines under Ladd were better prepared, and the campus retained most of them, and most of them graduated. To handle the increased enrollment, Ladd almost tripled the number of faculty members. Now, not everything he considered an achievement would be considered progress in the third decade of the 21st century. For example, in his final report to the executive committee of the Board of Curators, he loudly pronounced the following: "There are no young women in the school anymore," which elevates MSM to the status of a true technical institution. We got rid of the women, so now we can be a true School of Mines and Metallurgy. Still, a year after his departure from Rolla, peers had come to recognize the significant improvement in the School of Mines. Remember what the president of the Michigan School of Mines had said in 1897, "This place is not worthy of being called a School of Mines." In 1908, Victor Alderson, who was the president of the Colorado School of Mines, assessed the status of mining education all across the country. He concluded that on the whole, mining education is below the standards set by other kinds of engineering education. However, he noted that the great private schools like Columbia, Harvard, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology are flourishing, and the state mining schools of Michigan, Minnesota, Colorado, California, and Missouri are doing excellent work. Well, 3 decades after all of this, as Ladd learned that this professor, Claire V. Mann, was going to write a history of the campus, he wanted to send him all kinds of material to make his case for his role in making it a better institution. And the line I like the best is really his fundamental conclusion about his role at the Missouri School of Mines. And my conclusion is, he had. Thank you.